Hi, my name's Jack, and today we're going to be doing a Grisaille portrait. First things first, what is Grisaille? Grisaille essentially comes from the French term grey. So we're going to be using a very muted grey or dead palette. So that's going to be white, ivory black, and we're going to use some raw umber. Now, some people may say that to be a sort of true Grisaille, it's just white and black, and that using the umber makes it more of a sort of brunaille, because you end up with that sort of warmer and cooler variation within your mixtures. But personally, it gives a little bit more life to the painting, so I would prefer to do that. So, why paint a Grisaille? So often, the difficulties one gets into whilst painting with a full palette or even a limited palette is almost battling between the idea of colour and tone. And so by removing the idea of colour, we can focus purely on tone, where it becomes an almost sort of direct transition from our drawing. It also works as a fantastic underpainting, as well as creating beautiful paintings in itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay in the painting directly from the model. What you can also do is have a drawing, transfer the drawing and paint then in Grisaille. But what we're going to do is go straight on with the paint onto the canvas. So terms you might hear people talk about when they're talking about their palette and organising their palette is open and closed palette. Now an open palette is essentially where you just have the pure paint straight from the tube and you mix as you go. That's essentially what an open palette is. A closed palette is where you have these pre-mixed and you work from your pre-mix a lot more sort of rigorously. Whilst a closed palette is where you'll have a couple of pre-mixed. There isn't really a specific amount of pre-mixing one needs to do or not. Some people find it more helpful to have more and will do multiple strings of 7, 9 tones, including warms and cools. Whilst I would like to start off with 3, because I find to make sure that I keep the painting simple in the early stages and help grouping those larger pools of light and dark together, that having a slightly simpler palette, so a sort of semi-open palette or a semi-closed palette, just aids me in keeping a nice, simple, easy start. But there isn't a right or wrong way to go about that. It is very much down to you. What I would say is often you'll find that working with an open palette as a beginner can become a bit messy. So potentially start off with at least a couple of pre-mixes just to aid you on your way. Just want to mix a mid-tone light. So just make sure I get this way. I can go lighter to get those highlights, but it also gives me room to go darker for those halftones and those transitions into shadow. And then let's get a sort of mid-tone for our darks as well. And then I'm going to do one for essentially the darker elements of that shadow. So I'm just going to use these 2 colours for that. A little bit lighter here. And I'm just going to start off with these 3. What you could do is mix a couple of midtones if you wanted, including a highlight tone. But for me, I'm going to start off with these 3, and I think as I start laying in, hopefully it becomes sort of clear as to why, for me, it works keeping it nice and simple early on. because we're going to be doing this over a relatively short period of time, I'm going to be using basically just a little bit of linseed oil as my medium to help the flow of the paint. And I've got a tiny bit of terps there, which I will use very sparingly just to fill the canvas nice and early, and maybe to help charge my brush at the beginning to help the paint flow off it. So when I'm thinking about setting up a pose, certain things I'm looking at, a pose which I think suits the model, tries to sort of really encapsulate, I think, the best qualities of the models are, but also creating a light effect that not only flatters and aids in the creating of a sort of beautiful painting, but also aids me as a painter in how I'm going to see. So for that is I want a couple of key shadows to essentially anchor my painting off. So let's see what we can find. A little bit, and chin down a little bit. So with this pose, I have a nice solid shadow shape across the eyebrow, down the side of the nose and underneath the nose, and a shadow up and down the right hand side of the face, which is going to help me really anchor the rest of the head on those major shadows. So personally I think it's a little bit more interesting than the sort of passport style straight on front profile. But what is really important when you're painting, certainly from life, on a model who isn't looking straight at you, is to make sure that you're doing your viewing from the same spot. And it seems quite self-explanatory, but if I'm viewing our model from here, I'm seeing a very different side to if I'm viewing him from further back. So it's key to come back and do all your viewing from the same spot. So just the first couple of marks is I'm just essentially figuring out size and placement of the head on my canvas. So first mark's normally top of head, bottom of chin, back of head, and then front of head. And what you want to make sure is that you don't have head placed in a rather sort of strange part of the canvas. Make sure that you're really making the portrait fit within your canvas in the best way possible. So even if you spend the first sort of 20-25 minutes of your painting just making sure that you've got the head in the right place, I think it's so beneficial. Because you can do a great head which then sits in a sort of rather strange position in the canvas which slightly throws you off on where you're going. So I'm going to start off, because I'm working quite small, with a relatively small filbert brush. Means I can get a quite specific line, but also there's going to be enough sort of strength to the brush to put the paint down nice and easily. So again, first couple of marks, it's just getting those, essentially you're finding out where those key shadows are. So those key shadows are going to be the brows, underneath the nose, underneath the jaw. And so you get general placements for them nice and early. So today I'm working on a toned canvas. So yesterday I wiped a very thin layer of raw umber on the canvas. And what this does is it slightly helps you to see, or helps me to see, the tones which I'm putting down earlier on. If I'm working on a white canvas, for me it's a little bit like when you're driving on a motorway and someone has their full beams on. You can't really see the tones of the colours around you because you're slightly blinded by the lights of that sort of pure white. So if I was working on a white canvas, I'd be trying to kill the white as quickly as possible. Whilst on this, I've already got a sort of mid-tone down, which is also closer to the colour of my palette. So what I'm seeing when I'm mixing the paint is closer to what I'm seeing when I put it down. When you're laying in or starting a painting, always try and start with these larger, more geometric straights. Almost see yourself like a sort of sculptor working on a block of marble. And so you're able to chop straights off rather than having to find curves. So you want to see yourself almost as if you're a sculptor chopping either wood or marble. Go from a much larger shape, closing in on our final shape through these larger straights. That way we're going to keep indentations and curves under control, and even the smaller, more intricate parts I'm still working with straights. Essentially we're trying to find the sort of geometry of the face. And what I'm doing is just separating light and dark whilst working up the external contour. And bear in mind, these first marks, they're not going to be 100% accurate. You are going to correct them. So it's better to get something down so we can then see what needs to be corrected rather than being too precious over these initial marks. So be nice and broad, nice and confident, get a couple of marks down. I'm really squinting and simplifying the shapes at the moment. So I'm seeing what I can place into shadow and what is in light. So once I've got a general idea of the rough shape of the head, I can start to incorporate that generalized mid-tone for the light as well. Just so we're starting to sort of mass in with essentially both sides of the coin. I'm using a much larger brush now, as I know I'm just sort of massing in larger areas. Always try and use essentially the most efficient brush for the marks you're trying to be making. So if you can, you know, make a mark in a couple of strokes, it's going to be easier than filling, and quicker and easier than filling in the whole thing with. So it's starting very general, light, dark. I'm still going to be sort of moving things around for quite a while at this point. So even at this point, you know, I'm really just simplifying where's light, where's dark. So there are parts where I'm already slightly putting in a bit of a mid-tone just to help get that turn. So essentially, whilst this is looking incredibly vague now, what I'm doing is as closer I get to being confident on where those larger shapes are, the more I'm going to hone in and get more specific with them. So essentially at the moment I'm trying to get that underdrawing whilst filling in some tone at the same time. So when it starts to get a little bit vague and blurry, always go back, try and find those straights to help anchor what you're drawing. So I started to get this much more specific, but at the same time still incredibly generalized idea of the shape of the head. And at this point I'm really not looking for features as such. You're looking more for where those sharper lines of shadow are. The features will come sort of organically through that larger pool of light and dark. So now that I've got a very rough indication of general placement in a head, size of the head I want to put on the canvas, I'm also going to incorporate background, neck and shoulders in there. And I think with the background is you want the background to, rather than just be a sort of flat surface, is try and create this sense of atmosphere with your background. And a lot of that is finding out how the background tonally relates to the portrait you're viewing, and a lot more so on how it relates to the contour that it's hitting. So you don't necessarily have to be 100% true to what you're seeing, because if you're working from life, as the day progresses, as the weather changes, the background changes, the tone of the background changes, the colour of the background slightly changes. But what doesn't change is the relationship of the background. For example, we have a lighter background here against the dark of his head. We have a slightly darker background here, but it's still light in relation to certain parts of his head. So you're looking for essentially the relationship between the background and the contour that it's touching. I want to keep it quite loose and airy. Lighter element of the background, but also darker than the light of the head. And because I want a slight contrast of the background and what will be the flesh tone, now so I'm going to work into the flesh tone a lot with these greys. Probably going to end up getting a lot cooler, so I want a little bit more warmth in the background. And I don't mind too much if I lose the odd edge at this point. But just get an indication for the contour, and that's also then going to help us see, when we start to establish our value range a little bit more, how light or dark we can go. So I'm going to ignore the chair behind him. And I can tell that what would be the case is we'd end up with a darker background coming down against the light of the neck. So it'd be slightly darker than the light of the neck. But it might still be lighter than what's going on here, but again, I'm focusing on how it's relating to the external contour of the figure that it's next to. And when you're going for stuff like the shirt, or hair, or beard, is we're not looking at these as separate entities. We're looking at them still as how the light is bouncing off a form. So if the light flows from one to the other, you have it as light. If its shadow flows from one to the other, you have it as shadow. So that the key is to not separate different elements of the painting purely because we would separate it in a more vocal description. And again, I can see that this here is going to be lighter than the contour it's touching. And you might find when you put in the background that you lose some of the contour, lose some of the sharp. So what we need to do then is just go back in and re-establish a lot of it. Simplify that for the moment, and then I'll get back into it. So I think if you ever feel that you're starting to lose those key shapes, starting to lose a likeness, starting to lose the structure of your drawing, is always go back and re-establish your shadow shapes. And I would say this is the same thing as essentially the first step you do when you come back to a painting, is you re-establish our shadow shapes. And a lot of that is almost a sort of signal of intent, because one can get very precious about what they've put down. But if you go in, re-hit your shadow shapes, essentially firm up the edges which you may have softened a little bit the session before, it gets you into the sort of mindset of, I can repaint what I've got down, I can make things better, rather than I must keep the work I'd done before. So again, still working with that base light tone, base shadow tone. And I can see already that my base light tone is probably a little bit too light. So gives me a lot of leeway to push those midtones a little bit more. But I imagine when I establish my value range, which I will do soon by putting in the highlights and the darker elements within the shadows, that it'll give me a little bit more leeway to push my lights a little bit darker. And going back to, as you're always going back to those sort of key shapes and those major proportions, those larger pools of light and dark, it's good to sort of keep in mind almost sort of a generalization of where these features may lie. So for example, eyes tend to be around the middle of the head, probably just above the center point of the head. Nose tends to be about, obviously changes dramatically between each person, but around midway between the eyes and the chin, and then midway between the chin and the bottom of the nose tends to be the mouth. But that way, if you keep that sort of generalization in your head, you're not going to end up extending the mask of the face too high in the head, or having the length of the nose or placements of the mouth too far off from where they should be. So once again, it's going back in, trying to find and re-establish your shadow shapes. And really quick squinting. So what squinting is going to do is it's going to suppress your value range. So you're going to easily see what you can put into shadow and what you can put into light. If in doubt, squint, simplify, and go back to those larger pools of light and dark. Still working with straights, but just trying to find a little bit more specific placements. So again, when it comes to drawing features, as I'm not looking at I'm not worried about the fact that I'm painting an eye as such. I'm painting light and dark, and the eye hopefully should come organically through that if I get those relationships correct. Really sort of looking at comparative measurement on where things are. So for example, where's the tip of the nose in relation to the ear? Where does it fall in relation to the eye on this side? And I started darkening my midtone as I realised it needed to get a fair bit darker, certainly as the light turns away from the light source a little bit. So for example, under the cheekbone, there's quite a considerable angle change. When you get a much darker, and a good way to check how light or dark things need to be is by establishing your value range. And I'm doing that by hitting our lightest lights, which are the highlights. I can see that my highlights up here aren't jumping off in the same way they are in nature, and therefore I've got to darken the base tone around it. And obviously whilst I'm darkening, I'm also continually looking to see how I can edit those shapes to be a little bit more accurate and specific. So starting to lose the shapes a little bit. So what I do is I go back, really try and re-establish those shapes. 90% of the information we're going to be putting down is along a contour edge or a shadow edge. So getting those shapes as specific as possible, regardless of how long that takes, is going to be so key. So now it's important for me to really establish our value range, hit our darks. And you'll find that probably as you progress through the painting, you probably have to continue re-hitting these, re-establishing them but it's always good to go in and be bold, and often you'll probably find, or I find, I end up having to hit the darks a little bit darker than I initially sort of believed. So keep in mind, black's quite a thin pigment, so you're going to need a fair amount of it. And at the moment, I'm not too concerned about the highlights on the hair. They're going to be darker than all the lights anyway. Because although that they're highlights within the hair, because they're surrounded by that sort of dark of the black of the hair, they register to us as lighter, because ultimately that's how we often see tone is in relation to what is directly around it, which is quite tricky when you're painting, because obviously as you're painting you want to be viewing them in relation to the whole image rather than just its sort of local surroundings. Once again, just trying to re-establish the shapes a little bit more, see what I can do. I can see quite easily now that the nose needs to get a little bit longer. I can also then need to get rid of the highlight on the tip of the nose as it was in the wrong spot. So even when you're putting in highlights, those initial marks you put down may not be the ones which last till the end of the painting. You're using them as a gauge for not only placement but for tonal structure of the painting. So at this point, whilst we're constantly going back to that sort of linear contour around the shadow edge and contour edge, we also want to be building it up a lot more through tone. And so you're looking for tonal relationships, certainly around the contour. And I'm not that fussed about sort of smudging things around if I think they're in the wrong spot. So again, I knew that mid-tone was too light, so it gives me the opportunity to darken it and also to find the front plane of the head. So to really try and find the angle of the nose, I want to relate it to where certain parts of the nose are in relation to the brow. So for example, I can really have a look at where this nostril sits in relation to the brow and the eye above it, which should help me place it a little bit more accurately and get the relationship between nose and eyes a little bit better. Then I'm also going to use placement of the eyes to figure out where the corner of the mouth is. And I think one of the sort of common mistakes people make when painting or drawing mouths is they have this sort of sharp contour over every section of the mouth, when often it's a lot more subtle, because actually the turning away from the form is far more subtle. So don't get caught up with the idea of sort of essentially the local colouring of the mouth. Really just try and see it as, how is that form turning away from the light? If he was a marble sculpture, what separation would we see? So now that I've got my darkest dark in, which I'll probably just quickly re-hit again. Now at this point in proceedings, where I'm roughly happy with the general placement of features, this is when I can start to look more at the planes of the head. And this is when those extra premixes would start to come in. So the reason I didn't go in with 4 or 5 different premixes on my palette is because I needed to get to this point first before I can really start thinking about trying to sculpt out those different planes. Obviously, the lightest parts of the portrait are going to be the parts facing most directly to our light source. And as you're placing them, personally I like to place them a little bit more opaquely than a lot of the paint we've got down so far. And then we can start to really find where the form turns. So under the zygomatic bone, the cheekbone, turns away from the light source, so it becomes a lot darker. To start to establish these relationships, because obviously if this tone here and this tone here are the same, what that starts to suggest is that they're at the same angle towards the light, which they clearly aren't. So we know that the neck needs to get another layer of paint on to turn away. So I'm just placing where those highlights are, and we're going to refine those shapes in a second, but just making sure the moment we know where those essentially lighter or lightest lights are. So what I need to do is really make sure that tonally what I'm painting is making sense to where the form is in relation to the light source. So when you're doing this, it's really important to squint, to simplify what you're seeing. And bear in mind, not all transitions are going to be the same. Certainly when it comes to stuff like the hair, the brow, the beard, there is going to be a lot of variation within that. So this is the kind of point where you start to think more about variety starts to come in. And I'm still painting in a very sort of broad, simple way. I'm not putting a huge amount of variety down, but it is just trying to figure out where those key shifts are. So whilst I'm starting to get a little bit more sense of understanding of tone within the head, the relationships between the background and the head have slightly changed. So I need to re-establish those relationships. And I'm going to do this with a bit drier paint because it's quite a thin pigment. The only pigment out of the three which actually has, a huge amount of body to it is the white. And for most of the backgrounds, I'm not using a huge amount of that, so I don't want to thin it down too much by adding much more oil to it. Now if you were working over a couple of days, you could let this dry. It'd be a lot easier then to paint on top of. We're going to see how much we can do today with this sort of wet into wet. So when there were parts of the form and its relationship to either the background, a shirt, neck to hair, if you've got a girl with long hair or something like that, is if you can't see an edge clearly and they're lost into a shadow, don't try and sort of arbitrarily find it. Paint what you can see. So over the break, I've slightly softened some of the transitions, just because at the moment none of them are the definitive articles, so I'm still building up that underlayer. So at the moment I'm not that worried, you know, if I'm losing a bit of information. Now obviously coming back from a break, first thing we do as always is go back, re-establish our shadow shapes with nice solid light and dark. A little bit this way. Okay, perfect. So using a slightly smaller brush as we're getting into parts where we can get a little bit more detail now. Now that we've started to get the shapes a little bit more accurately, we can start to sort of characterize those shadow shapes a touch more. And in the same way that, you know, I'm getting smaller brushes in to focus on getting those dark shapes a little bit more accurate, we also realize it is a game of push and pull, and so we're going to need to get a little bit more specific with some of the light shapes. So it will be basically sort of chiseling in from both sides at certain points. Now whilst I'm doing that, I'm also making decisions about tone. So for example, when working on this section, I know that at the moment I've probably gone very slightly too light here in relation to the whole portrait. So whilst correcting, I need to correct with a slightly darker tone. Now, there's a very subtle highlight on this cheekbone here, which is going to be very important to put in, but also you've got to realise that it's going to still be a lot darker than what we probably first think. Just because it's surrounded by darker tones, it registers in our mind as lighter. So you've got to be careful of not getting caught up with that and making it too light, because what that'll do will pull the whole cheek too far over for our portrait. We also essentially, certainly if like me you're painting alla prima and you haven't had the advantage of having the underlayer dry, is you're going to be having to use more paint, you know, thicker, more opaque paint as we get further on in the painting. Just otherwise you're going to struggle to get it to actually sit on the canvas. So even for those slightly smaller, more intricate parts, still try and break it up using straights. When you're painting stuff like cheekbones, remember one will always correlate with the one on the other side of the head, so make sure that they're working together. So often you see these portraits where cheekbones don't match up and it totally throws off the whole structure of the head. So it's at this point in the painting where not only are we starting to get more specific with our shadow shapes, you know, and those key points, but we're also starting to think about how they're turning, whether they've got sharper or softer edges. And that's where we're going to start to really characterize. So at this point we should have essentially the grounding of the likeness there, but to really start to sort of push that and characterize the features, we need to start thinking not only about the intricacies of those shapes, but how they bleed off into the lights. So with the dry brush here, I'm just pushing the paint, which I've already got on the canvas, around a little bit, just to push it into the position I prefer it to be in. Manipulating what I've already got down rather than necessarily putting more information down in parts. Obviously, what can happen when you do this is you lose too much information, you lose too much of the shapes. So always be careful when softening on the canvas that you don't totally lose all the hard work you've put down. Stuff like the nostril, keep it a little bit softer than what you sort of initially would think, because it's a sort of inward turn. It's much softer than what you might think. So try and keep that edge nice and soft, which will just help with that inward turn. So with a really small brush, just trying to make sure these edges are soft enough. You know, the nose, the brow, the mouth, there's so many little shifts of soft and sharp that you can really spend time honing in on those little bits of variation. And so much of working with an edge, if you're trying to soften it, is often you over soften it and you lose that edge. So you've then got to go back and find it. But don't worry too much about, you know, going through that stage. Don't be afraid to sort of find it and lose it and find it and lose it. So again, keep going back and forth until you find those shapes which you're really happy with. There are always going to be parts, certainly after a break, where you start to see mistakes. You can see where you can edit. Because over time, the more you look at something, certainly in an elongated amount, you know, in an elongated amount of sort of a time over sitting, the more your mind starts to sort of auto-correct what you're seeing. So you start to become blind to your mistakes. And that's where something like a mirror is really helpful. And you can just, if you don't have a mirror, you can use a phone, which most people do have in their pocket, and you can use that as a black mirror. So for example, from where you were standing, if you were to take your phone, have it on a lock screen, put that up to your nose, stand about 45 degrees to where, so 90 degrees from where you were. You're looking anyway, so you can look at both your image and the model. What it does is it tricks your eye into believing that it's seeing the image for the first time again, or see it afresh. You start to once again become slightly more aware of what you're looking at. So I want to really keep squinting, and certainly on stuff like the brow here, you can see how if you really squint, it almost blends off into the tone, the flesh above it, and then almost darkens into the eye socket, turning away from our light source underneath. So I still want to be working as much as I can with little straights rather than trying to curve what I'm seeing. What tends to happen is when you try and curve what you're seeing is you over curve it. I just have to double check where I placed the eye, realise it's just coming a little bit too far. What I can also see is the highlight on the bridge of the nose is a little bit too tucked into the eye socket here, and it's probably a little bit sharp, so it gives me the opportunity to just push it over a little bit and sort of build up towards that highlight. Again, if in doubt, go back and re-hit those darks. So I think getting this angle here is going to be so important for me, and it's been one which has been fairly elusive so far. Taking vertical plumb line from the inside corner of the brow, and doing the same the outside of the nostril here to really sort of hone in on where the nose is situated. And again, it's something, certainly with the nose, which is so important to squint. The squinting is going to help me get those tonal shifts on the underside of the nose as it starts to turn away from our light source. So I can always already start thinking about temperature as well. I know that tip of the nose is going to be a little bit warmer. Essentially, as a general rule, warmer halftones tend to come forward a little bit in the painting, whilst cooler ones sit back. So I can keep that in mind whilst turning the shadow edge of the underside of the nose. I'm going to very slightly exaggerate some of the shifts in temperature, just in tone within the hair, just to give it a little bit more variety coming up and down the contour. Because what I want to do is try and avoid too much of a sharp hairline coming round. So now starting to focus a little bit more on the relationship between the external contour and the background to help aid what's inside. At this point, every mark you're putting down should help the painting become closer to the finished article, help aid you to see what needs to be done. This is not the time to be putting down sort of marks for the sake of putting down marks. So even with stuff like the creases in the eye, there's a sharp and a soft to each side, so bear that in mind. If you want creases in the skin to become convincing, really look at where's sharp, where's soft. To make sure I don't go too bright with the lights on the right hand side. So really spend time analysing the tones you've got down. Are they too light? Are they too dark? Are they working in the way you want them to? So I can see that this section isn't turning away in the way I'd like it to, so I need to darken it to really establish the fact that it's turning away from our light source. I'm trying not to be too caught up with stuff like the stubble at this point. I'm focusing more on form than stuff like local colouring. Again, even at this point, I'm trying to work with big, simple strokes as much as I can. Obviously, as I'm getting into these sort of areas, that becomes harder, but essentially, you want to be almost as efficiently lazy as you can be when painting. There's no point doing extra work for no reward. And often you end up sort of slightly doing it at your own detriment, and I kind of see it as like pebble dashing a stately home. It's not overly necessary, and in the end probably ends up with a slightly uglier or less successful final image than what you once had. So it's about spending more time just being really analytical on what you want to put down, what you're trying to achieve with your brush strokes. It's so important on something like a grisaille to make sure that you don't lose your value range too much. Because obviously the more we work into it, the more there's a chance of sort of dirtying or sullying your lightest light or lightening your darkest dark. So it's always good to go back and re-establish them every now and again, just to make sure that everything's still working within that sort of tonal realm which you've established. So in the last 20 minutes of this session, what I'm going to be doing is preparing the canvas to let it dry a little bit overnight, and so I can come back to it tomorrow and see where we can sort of push it and finish it off. And to do that, a lot of it is making sure that I'm happy with the edges. If I'm not, I want to soften them. And a lot of that, I think, is a psychological reasoning as much as the technical reasoning, where if I leave a sharp edge in oil and it dries, it's very difficult to then move or soften it without having to paint opaquely over the top. And certainly using these paints, which are slightly more thinner, a little bit more translucent, that can become a real mission to do. So unless we're really happy with the edge, it's probably within our interests just to soften it up a little bit. But also, psychologically, if we have a very sharp defined line on the painting, we are less inclined to want to change it, because we think, that's a very definitive line, that must be correct. But if it's soft, if it's very soft, even if it's slightly over softened, you feel the desire and need to almost work more into it, whether it's needed or not in many cases. What's also going to be the benefit is it's going to allow this painting to dry a little bit, which is going to make painting on top of it that much easier, because it's going to hold the paint a lot more. Whilst at the moment it's a little bit oily, we're getting a little bit of a sort of slip when it comes to putting down new bits of information. So for me, the thing which is jumping out is overly sharp. It's the base of the nose at the moment. And I know it can also get a little bit more angled, so I can sort of soften it towards a final goal. Whilst you're softening, you're not just arbitrarily softening, you're softening towards your end piece, your goal. But ultimately, if you're working on a painting for more than one session, the first session is so much just about establishing the key shapes, the key tonal relationships. Before then really characterizing them a little bit more later on. So I know tomorrow, a lot of work to do on the lips, a lot of work to do on the transitions, come to the hair. I mean, essentially, tomorrow we want to get another whole layer of paint on everything, which sounds like a lot, but bear in mind today we've probably gone 2 or 3 layers, and we've had to get the drawing done from scratch. So we're slowly getting closer to. So what I don't want is these sort of patches where there's nothing down at this point. Let's get some paint down, so at least, even if we don't have information there, we've got an even surface to work on. Because for me, I find it so much easier to work up a surface once there's a certain amount of paint on there. So again, with things like the ear, it's so easy to see it either totally by itself or to almost ignore it. And these two things are quite dangerous. You don't really want to have a fantastic portrait with then an ear which isn't painted, or a portrait with an ear with glistening highlights that overpower everything else on the head because it's been viewed individually. We always have to make sure that every feature we paint and we draw works in relation to the whole. And I say this about the ear just because, it tends to be visually a little bit separate in the sense that it's behind the hairline, it's a little bit further away from the head, and there's a lot more detail in it than many of the other sections around it, so you tend to look into it more. So whilst it's also bulking out the contour a little bit, we also see widths in relation to heights. So if I've gone a little bit long, that could also emphasize the lack of width. But I know, even though I'm changing it now and trying to get it as specific as possible, that's something I've got to come back and look at straight away when I come back to the image tomorrow. So we're back for a second session on our Grisaille painting. A lot of the sort of excess oil or terps which we used in the first session is now evaporated off, which gives us a great opportunity to put down a lot more paint, to really hit our tonal values, and to sort of push the painting a lot more. So first things we do when we come back is we check to see if it's sunken in, and by checking to see if it's sunken in, you're essentially looking to see where on the painting the paint suddenly looks really matte and lifeless. And although that is a perfectly normal, natural part of painting, what it does do is it means that when you're looking at your painting and putting fresh paint down, is you're making judgments off something which isn't the true value of the paint. Depending on your approach for the next day, you can either oil out, retouch varnish, or just paint completely over. We don't have a huge amount of sinking in, probably sunken in a little bit here on the darks. You'll probably find that most sections of the painting which do sink in tend to be around the darker areas. So because I know that I'm going to re-hit these areas sort of very early on in the day, I'm not that worried about oiling out or retouch varnishing them, because I know I'm going to get basically a fresh layer of paint over the top. But if, let's say, I was just working on this little area here, I would definitely put some retouch varnish on before the session so I can make judgments based on the proper value of the paint. And if you are going to retouch varnish or oil out, and oiling out is essentially a really thin layer of your medium sort of over the painting. If you are to do that, oiling out, generally speaking, what I would do is make sure that you're putting fresh paint down on there, or you're taking it off at the end of the session. Otherwise you can end up with this sort of gloopy, quite uncontrollable amount of medium over your painting. But for retouch varnishing, because retouch varnish generally has quite a lot of terps in it, you want the paint to be pretty much touch dry, but also you want to leave it about 10-15 minutes before you start painting. So come in before your model, retouch varnish, get everything looking lively, and then let the turpentine evaporate a little bit. You're still going to have that little bit of layer of varnish, and then it's going to be easy to work on without having to battle against that layer of terps. So what I'm going to do, first when I attack this for the second session, is, like we did last time, is go back and re-establish our shadow shapes. each time I come back to a painting, that's the first thing I do. Not only does it help make sure that your structure and the shapes are working well, but it also mentally sort of forces you to sort of put paint down where in many ways you think, ooh, I quite like that bit of paint, I quite like what I've done there. So you're sort of almost battling through your natural tendency to be a little bit timid when it comes to change. So you want to always start with that sort of, notion of intent by putting the paint down, making sure that those edges are nice and wet so you can work into them. So I'm going to re-hit them, and then because we've got this much more sort of receptive surface now, I'm going to re-hit my darks, re-establish my value range, and go on from there. So when you get the model back up, it's really important to make sure that the pose is the same as what you've been working on, because otherwise you constantly find yourself chasing and redrawing and ultimately making far more work for yourself. Remember, you want to be as efficiently lazy as possible. So if you can get everything sorted before you start, it's going to make life so much easier. Like with yesterday, I've got my pre-mixed colours for my sort of semi-open palette. I think as you get further along in the painting, the idea of the pre-mixtures become slightly less integral, because I think you want to be slightly more reactive to what you're seeing on the canvas and on the model. But also bear in mind, when you're working from life, colours change due to the weather outside. Whether the models run in because they're running late, there are variations. So the key is you're looking more for relationships in the subject rather than necessarily constantly chasing every change and bit of variation you see throughout the days. So what I'm doing is re-establishing the edge of my shadows. I'm not putting an opaque layer within all my shadow edges. I'm just making sure that if I want to play with that edge, that I've got paint which is malleable enough to do so. And so it's not a thing of creating this sort of opaque shadow layer. If anything, you want the shadow to be a little bit thinner, so it breathes a little bit more and you build up the opacity in the lights. Now, yesterday, as you can see, probably from the slight change of the painting on how we left it to how it is now, is I wasn't particularly happy with the placement of the mouth and the chin, and so I softened it. I probably maybe even over-softened it a little bit, but it's going to force me to go back into that part of the painting and really reanalyze and try and re-establish what I essentially failed to do yesterday. And I think what generally you find is, certainly after the first session, is that even if the darks and the lights you thought you had sort of really established and nailed your value range, is you tend to find that you can probably come back and push them a lot more on day two. So with the mouth, I'm really looking for what parts of the lips are in shadow, and what parts are in light, rather than drawing these sort of Valentine's Day sort of smooch style lips. We don't want to over-emphasize a sort of separation of lips to the rest of the head. Because ultimately, yes, there's a slightly different local colouring to the lips. They tend to be a little bit redder, but that's generally because there's a slightly thinner layer or less layers of skin over the top of it. So see it more as, if it's light, it's just part of that transition of light. And you'll find that also colours-wise, they tend to be a lot more subtle than people give them credit for. Often, certainly with beginners, you see these very cut out red lips, which have this sort of lipstick style effect. And again, even at this point where you feel that you're getting quite, deep into the portrait, is you're still looking to keep those shadows incredibly simple. Like with an alla prima or a longer pose portrait, the information you lose in the shadows essentially gains intrigue within the lights. So I'm going to be treating the moustache and the beard as this shadow for the most part. But certainly with stuff like the nostril, where I want to keep that edge a little bit softer than what I've got at the moment. So I want to get that nice fresh layer of paint down, so that then when I start to turn that edge, I can manipulate it from both sides of the transition. So I could probably be using a slightly larger brush for this section, because obviously you want to be using a brush which is suitable for the mark you're making. And as I was going round the other shadow edges, the smaller brush made sense. When I started putting in a little bit more tone for the beard, probably should have moved to a larger brush, but at the moment still just jumping between re-establishing our shadow edge and massing in, so being a little bit lazy here, getting a little bit of lift off because we've still got quite a lot of oil underneath. So what I'm going to have to do with that is just use more paint. And often when you do get lift off, which is essentially when you're trying to put down more paint, and you find that actually all you're doing is taking paint off. Sometimes there is nothing you can do about it. Other times you just need a little bit more paint, and paint slightly more opaquely. So let's stop myself being too lazy and start using larger brushes for larger areas. Certainly with something like the neck, as you will find that if I'm focusing on just painting the neck, it's going to appear to me a lot lighter than it actually is. What you want to look at when you are trying to judge or view the tones of these more sort of periphery elements of the portrait is look at the brightest bright and then almost use your peripheral to make a judgment on the tones when it comes to stuff like the neck. So that's probably still even a little bit too light on that part there, but just thought I'd mass it in a little bit, get an indication for where I want the collar to go, and maybe a slight indication for the Adam's apple. And you'll find that certainly when it comes to sort of shadow edges along stuff like the neck, is you can be a lot softer than what you think. What you often see, and often sort of, in my opinion, sort of pulls back the quality of a lot of portraits, is neck, shoulders, ears, as I spoke about yesterday, which don't have that observed quality which the rest of the face does. So not only are you trying to get it nicely observed, but you also want to get it so that it works within the overall focus of the piece. So now make the use of having that more receptive surface and re-hit your darkest darks. Re-establish our value range. So yesterday when I was trying to put this kind of tone down, it became a lot thinner, didn't really sit on the canvas as well. Now it's starting to sit a lot more. I can get that variety in the hair, I can push those darks, and I can then sort of slightly re-evaluate my lights. How light or dark do I want something to be? I think most people tend to either start a painting with a very sort of underhit tonal range, whilst, you know, there are the odd few who go the other direction and go with a much sort of darker base of everything and then find they have to lighten everything. So I think it's always good to kind of keep in mind what your habits are when you're painting. And whether that's when you're painting a grisaille or whether when you're painting an alla prima or a full, you know, a longer pose portrait, is the more you can sort of slightly preempt the tendencies which tend to be sort of recurring in your work, the easier it is to change them nice and early on. And I think so often, certainly when we're doing, you know, a limited palette or a full palette portrait, is that the idea of colour can throw off the control of tone. So this is why doing something like a grisaille is such a great exercise or way of starting a painting. Because you can basically do a whole grisaille painting and glaze in some colour, which keeps everything a little bit more restrained and controlled, but also probably doesn't really lead to that much, I guess, leniency when it comes to making design choices on the fly, because you tend to then feel that you've slightly undone all the hard work you've done underneath. But I think it's such a great way of getting people to understand, A, the importance of tone. Because I think certainly nowadays we are bombarded with the idea of colour when it comes to sort of television, when it comes to movies, when it comes, I mean, that when we start to paint, we're almost more focused on colour over tone, but actually to get that sense of form, to get a likeness correct, it's not getting the perfect colour harmonies in our model or, you know, landscapes, but it's more actually getting the tonal values correct. If you get the tonal values correct, you can paint him green and blue, and he's still going to register as him, as a understood and observed portrait. You get sort of a couple of fantastic artists who are sort of good examples of this. I think there's a painter called Glenn Brown who does essentially reimaginings of, or has done reimaginings of master paintings, but with far more wackier colour palettes. But because the tonal values make sense, the portrait still very much holds together. So if anything, you know, colour should be a sort of secondary byproduct of the painting or focus of the painting, whilst tone is always that primary. So now that I've re-hit on my darkest dark, what I should probably do is re-hit my lightest light. Because even by looking at it, you can kind of think, well, it seems pretty bright to me. I don't really need to change a huge amount. And then if you put a sort of a fresh bit of paint next to it, you can suddenly go, actually, maybe it does need a change. So it's difficult to really tell straight away. See that, I mean, probably a little bit light anyway, but it does very much suggest how much I can still push those lights. And you can make decisions on how subdued or suppressed you want your tonal range to be. But I think to give yourself a nice sense of leeway when it comes to modelling, to getting those halftones and those transitions correct, you don't want to suppress it too much. But ultimately, once you've established your value range, as long as what you've put down works within this world that you've created in the same sort of manner and relationship that it does in nature, regardless of the compression which you've gone for, you're still going to have a sort of understood and working painting. So as you work up your painting, you're going to find that some of those initial markers and tones you put down don't quite register in the same way they did. So you might have to go back, double check them, make a few adjustments. Like I say, that's perfectly normal. You're not going to get things 100% right at the beginning. What you want to do is also make sure that you don't have certain parts lagging totally behind. So I need to work on the ear, the collar, figure out how the background and the hair really sort of add into the portrait a little bit more, whilst obviously reassessing what I've got down in the face and those relationships. So with the ear, like I mentioned before, it's really important not to let the highlights which we see in the ear overpower what's going on in the rest of the head, because the ear tends to be a little bit darker, it's set back a little bit, and obviously it being surrounded by the hair in the background, we've got a dark background, those highlights are going to jump out a little bit more visually than what their actual sort of tonal value is. So we can be quite cautious when building up these, and it's quite easy with the ear and so in the external contour of the hair, neck, is to get into the trap of being a little bit linear with it. You know, we're painting whilst we start off relatively linear, in the sense that we start off geometrically putting down these straight lines. Bear in mind we are describing a mass of form rather than a walled structure. So I'm trying to keep the tonal shifts within the ear apparent but not overpowering. And sometimes that is easier said than done, but we'll give it a go. And again, a lot of it is how much information do I need to put down? You know, if I've got quite a broad and simply painted face, if you then draw every single little shift in tonal variation in a sort of secondary focal point like an ear, it might drag the viewer's attention over a bit too much. So figure out what you need to put down, what you want to put down, what you're trying to describe, and try and get a little bit more warmth to the lobe of the ear. Whilst I want to have it lighter, just introducing a little bit more umber into that mix. Like with any contours, you also then have to sort of think, how is the contour of that reacting and relating to the external contour. So it's quite nice. I think the ear is wrapping round quite nicely. Shapes need to be a little bit more specific to him, so not quite his ears at the moment, a little bit sort of generic there. Time is almost up for me when it comes to this painting. I'm going to start to think more about, you know, the effect of the painting overall. Where I want sharper, softer edges, where I want the sense of focus to be. So you can spend as much time as you like on a painting. Don't sort of get caught up to the idea of it's taking too long, so it's no longer, you know, has the same sort of value or something. The idea of having to sort of churn out paintings within a certain time frame for it to be a success is something sort of, I think, driven purely by sort of social media show-offs rather than people actually worrying too much about the art itself. So it really doesn't matter how long it takes someone to make a piece of artwork, regardless of how large or small it is. So don't feel the need to sort of rush yourself. Take your time. Keep going back to those simple, larger shapes, and you can just keep pushing it until essentially you're happy with it. And I find certainly with clothing is try and work as much as you can again with straights and go for those larger folds, those larger, more sort of repeating. And when I say repeating, I mean, you know, if you're painting over a couple of sessions, where are those bigger shifts which happen every time your model sits down? Because those are going to be the one which are describing the form underneath. If you are permanently trying to draw every little crease, every little sort of fold on a shirt or something, you end up often with a slightly sort of formless, sort of wet plastic bag kind of look, in my opinion. So keep it simple, try and work broadly, nice simple straights. And again, you also don't want to sort of, well, you might, but generally speaking, you're not focusing on a portrait of a shirt with a man in it. You know, we're trying to get a portrait of a man in a shirt rather than a shirt on a man. Therefore, it's really important to try and figure out how the shirt is describing the form underneath. And I know I'm literally just painting a collar, but I thought I would talk a little bit more broadly about the idea of painting a bit of drapery. And I'm going to use the jumper as one of my darkest darks, vignette the head into, so I want to suggest the shoulders without them pulling up too much attention at this point, certainly because it's so closely cropped to the head. It's very much a head study, so, and then slightly lost some of those highlights and variation on the shirt. So again, going in with nice, simple, straight. Oh, might be a little bit too bright, that one. And if you do go a little bit too bright, you can always knock it back afterwards. So, as always, if your paintbrush is getting sullied, a bit sort of muddy, you're losing the clarity of what you're trying to put down, grab a new one. So these highlights in the shirt bouncing up way too much. So I've got a shirt a little bit skew with, but I could just open the collar a little bit, pull this back there. But for the moment, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start introducing a little bit more variety to the hair, hit those highlights in the hair just a touch more, work on the edge of the hair first, and then if we have time, I can always go back in. So try and keep a certain sense of ambiguity to hairlines, both in the external contour and the interior. Keep a nice soft hairline. You'll be amazed how soft one can go with the hairline and it still register as sharp. Add a little highlight band coming down there, probably a little bit too, a little bit too white, which is turning him slightly grey, so we just have to knock them back a little bit. Maybe we can even soften and tone them just a bit more. But we start to get an indication of the hair turning over. What I'd normally sort of do to try and, for the last couple of 5 minutes or so, I'm just looking at edges, atmosphere. Is there anything jumping out which I don't think is quite working, which needs to be changed? I think I could probably. So you're looking basically at edges. When I say atmosphere, I mean how the figure relates to the, to its outside world, to the background. So edges being the interior, atmosphere being the relationship between the subject and the background, making sure that works. Again, obviously all these things, you can keep working on them until you get to a much more sort of rendered or quote unquote finished look, but the process is always pretty much the same. You're working on these larger shapes, you're keeping the light and the shadows simple and actually just working out the shadow edges. And yes, as you get further on, those shifts are smaller, which is why it seems like you're going into more detail, but actually what you're working on is the same. So I'm just going to knock this lowest part back very slightly. Probably made it very slightly warm there, but so should have used a bit more black and white and a little bit less umber. But again, that's something which can easily be corrected. So just making the last couple of little adjustments before I'll call this one quits. Now what I might do, add the odd rogue hair to the contour, give that hair a little bit of life. You don't want sort of perfectly coiffured hair constantly on your painting, because hair does move. If you have hair which is too sharp when it comes to both edges, external and internal edges, often you end up looking more as if you've got a sort of Lego man's haircut on, rather than the sort of more naturalistic, lost and found edges that we see not only in nature but in those old master paintings which we love so much. So I'm going to leave it here for now, but like I said, feel free to always push your work as much as you want to. There is no definitive finishing point. So it's very much down to your sense of finish, your desires really.